Yeah, so let's go back to reading so I don't drown in shorts. Cool. Our ability to theorize. Wait, let's do it from the beginning. In Defense of Journalistic Paternalism, Ryan J. Thomas. Theory is a bedrock of our enterprise as scholars concerned with journalism's role in public life. For Christians, 2008, the long-term future of the field depends on the language of theory, not as an abstract authority, but to assist us in thinking more systematically about the major league issues we face together. Our ability to theorize hinges on clarity over concepts. This is perhaps of particular importance to normative theory concerning impactful issues, such as how we organize and conduct ourselves, the relationships we have with one another, and the rights and responsibilities we bear both in terms of our common humanity and because of the particular roles we occupy. Uh, cool. The goal of this essay is to introduce paternalism into our theoretical lexicon and defend it as a normatively positive concept. The term is perhaps best known through its semi-frequent invocation in debates about government regulation, raising questions about the purview of the state relative to the individual. Cornell, blah, blah, blah. Such discourse often positions paternalism as a prime facie, yeah, okay, facie wrong. Okay, so blah, blah. Possessing undesirable connotations of a nanny state, presuming to know that it's what is best for us. The concept has also been used in recent journalism scholarships, albeit shallowly theorized. Buggy, I suppose he wanted to write boogeyman, albeit as a shallowly theorized boogeyman out of step with the current vogues of participatory journalism and democratized process of media production. Within journalism ethics, scholarship specifically, paternalism is subject to critique, but is rarely affordable sustained expectations as a substantive, substantive concept in its own right. Maybe I should. Given the above, why paternalism? There is a growing body of literature in applied ethics and political philosophy that takes paternalism seriously as a normatively positive concept. This vigorous discussion is illustrative of how paternalism represents an important realm of applied in defense, an important realm of applied ethics. Dvolkin. I want to bring this conversation into our field, connecting debates about paternalism with our current discourse as media ethicists about the responsibilities of journalism in a democracy, which ought to be the bedrock of media ethics theorizing. I want to rescue paternalism from criticism and ignorance and take it seriously as a concept that can add much to our theorizing about journalism ethics. There are, I maintain, meaningful synergies between theorizing about the paternalism and our theorizing in media ethics. If our discussions of paternalism henceforth can come from a place of shared reference, our field will be richer for it. Simply, I believe it possible to establish fruitful ways of thinking about paternalism that ought not inspire fear or scorn. The structure of this essay is as follows. First, in order to contextualize the occasion for this argument, I outline some of the explicit and implicit objections to paternalism, recent scholars in journalism studies generally, and journalism ethics specifically. Second, I turn to the fundamental normative objections to paternalism outlined principally by Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill, on the grounds that paternalism undermines the human anatomy and claims to human rationality. Third, I explicate I explicate paternalism, discussing recent scholarship in applied ethics and political philosophy to provide a renowned account of its contours. Fourth, I apply paternalism to journalism by drawing on recent scholarship. Sorry. Uh, Specifically, I discuss how the notion of bounded rationality that questions the liberal tradition emphasis on anatomy, underpinned by human rationality, calls for a more analytical form of journalism. How the concept of nudging citizens towards welfare enhancing outcomes through choice architecture. Wait. Towards welfare enhancing outcomes through choice architecture is complementary to journalists' democratic function, and how the shift in emphasis away from autonomy towards opportunity and civic equality is theoretically synergetic with virtue ethics and its associated concept of flourishing. A flourishing as good as discussed by Borden and Ward. I conclude with some final comments about paternalism and its implications for journalism. Journalistic paternalism, the contemporary critique. A major work on normative theory argues that the citizen participation represents the underlying conception of the good in our present epoch. The citizen participation paradigm emphasizes the bottom-up nature of public life, characterized by the empowerment of citizens to harness processes of technological change to create their own media and subvert or bypass the existing media structure. The underlying logic of the citizen participation tradition holds that the media belongs to the people and fulfills an emancipatory, expressive, and critical purpose. Reflecting this, the embrace of participatory journalism and recent scholarship in journalism studies is emblematic of a broader embrace of the promises of digital technologies to inspire democratic weakening and draw more citizens into the workings of journalism. The aspiration of scholars working in this field is that citizens can harness software like blogs, wikis, video sharing sites, and social networking sites, and hardware like the cell phone to participate in the process of newsmaking and thus collapse the boundaries between journalists and audience. Journalism scholars have invoked paternalism to characterize the um, changing of the guard, so to speak, as an old media system characterized by hierarchies, closure, and control gives way to a new media system characterized by participation, openness, and fluidity. Baldwin and Duez, for example, discuss the shift in the relationship between supplier and user to the advantage of the latter changes the old paternalistic relationship into a new, more pragmatic arrangement and leads to a new emancipation of the information user. Anderson mentions how journalism's somewhat paternalistic vision of its audience has historically served the blunt impact of whatever limited audience measurement technologies might influence new production. Um, Branson Voldemort, right of journalists talking, right of journalists taking the need and interest of their audience more seriously, which means the disappearance of journalistic paternalism should be welcome. While Skorla and Van Dalen argue that journalists ought to take a more open, citizen-oriented focus rather than close paternalistic approach. Um, Criticism of paternalism, or a form of it, are implicit in a scholarship that emphasizes the democratization of media production, and popular works whose titles reveal their normative inclinations, such as We the Media and We're All Journalists Now. Such works emphasize how the news is no longer the sole provider of the press, and the maligned "you write, you read" model, characterized by media imposing the content on users whose only option is to consume or not to consume the news, is consigned to history. Considered in the aggregate, both implicit and explicit critique. Let's not be stupid. Cool. Considered in the aggregate, both implicit and explicit critiques pivot away from the idea of journalists paternalistically assuming to know what is the best interest of the public, contrasting the rhetorical violence of imposition with liberalized utopia of choice. Of concern here that these arguments valorize transformations that at least ought to be questioned, if not resisted outright. The normative logic of neoliberalism centers on decentralization, deinstitutionalization, and the flattering of hierarchies, theorizing society as a constellation of autonomous, unencumbered, and disarticulated individual capable of consistently and precisely determining their own interest and exercising rational choice to maximize them. Um, that the balkanizing tendencies of neoliberalism seem to be reflected in the aforementioned arguments is troubling and deserves further reflection. The particular concern here, however, is what this means for the concept of paternalism, which is regularly invoked but irregularly explicated. To give a detailed explanation of. Cool. Um, the particular concern here, however, is what this means for the concept of paternalism, which is regularly invoked but irregularly explicated. Within the journalism ethics literature, scholars have discussed paternalism, but generally positioned it as an undesirable concept. Maybe I can read in Hebrew if no one's watching. Plaisance, for example, discusses the importance of journalists making decisions about public interest without being paternalistic and condescending, without assuming that they know the best what their audience need, even if people object. Similarly, Borden describes paternalism as condescending to others by making choices for them. Stoker and Tusinski, Stoker, uh, though writing about public relations, caution against a paternalistic approach to communication, characterized by an elite father and noble disciple, invoking paternalism's uh, gendered and hierarchical implications. A more favorable account comes from Vanakar and Breslin, who associate paternalism with feminist care ethics, which assumes the best decision for the care recipient emerges from the dual relationship between caregiver and receiver. However, this account does not go on to to argue explicitly for paternalism as a normatively positive concept. Within the journalism ethics literature, then, paternalism is rarely explicated as a substantive concept in its own right, meriting scrutiny as a concept with the potential to add to our theoretical lexicon. However, if we look at literature from the other realm of applied ethics and political philosophy, there is a lively discussion about paternalism in its contours and contexts, from which there is much more we can learn. However, if paternalism is to be defended, it must first be defined. The next section outlines the particulars of paternalism and addresses how paternalism challenges the liberal philosophical traditions, strident emphasis on rationality and autonomy. Thus, the next section answers the question, what is the thing called paternalism anyway, and what is all the fuss about? Um, Etymologically, paternalism is derived from the Latin word pater, which means father, indicating a paternal and specifically father-child relationship. The term was first used in 19th century as an implied critique um, predicated on the inherent value of personal liberty and autonomy, positions elegantly outlined by Kant in 1785 and Mill in 1859. Paternalism, then, was introduced into the lexicon as a normatively negative term, deployed as a means of delineating an argument for autonomy, with its development as a concept and normative proposition in its own right much later. It is perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that paternalism tends to be viewed as intrinsically normatively negative in much of the discourse around the topic. Later efforts to outline paternalism's conceptual properties and present uh, so, later efforts to outline paternalism's conceptual properties and present present a compelling case. Later efforts to outline paternalism conceptual properties and present a compelling case for its merits have had to swim against the tide. The objections to paternalism are part of its history and woven into conceptual DNA, so to speak. Therefore, it is logical to begin with discussion of Kant and Mill before we can focus our discussion on conceptual properties of paternalism in its own right. Kant's deontological approach is centered on the capacity of humans for rational thought and the ability to act on the basis of reason. Kant's conception of rational agency underpins emphasis on human dignity, for it is on the basis that individuals are self-possessed moral agents, and they are capable of making decisions for themselves without external interference. It is in the rationality it is in the rationality that humans are autonomous. This makes humans of intrinsic worth as directors of their own life projects. This is key to Kant's moral enterprise, conceiving as he does of morality a deriving from reason and of people being in charge of their moral destiny. This is underscored in Kant's categorical imperative, one formulation of which commands us to act as to treat humanity, in every case as an end with all, never as means only. שוב. This is underscored in Kant's categorical imperative, one formulation of which commands us to act as to treat humanity in every case as an end with all, never as means only. From this perspective, So basically, it means that every thing that you do has a moral weight to it. Um, Even if you're doing it towards a good cause, your action might be a wrong action by Kant because of his moral categorical imperative. Treating others treating others as ends in themselves affords them the respect of our shared humanity. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty outlines a framework calling for limits on the powers that the state can use over the individual and the majority over a minority within a society. Mill grounds his argument in autonomy, holding that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of, of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others, his own good, to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. This is the essence of Mill's harm principle, holding the interference holding that interference in the affairs of another is justifiable only if harm can come to a third party. Mill venerates framing the plan of our life to suit our own character without impediment from our fellow creatures, so long as we do not harm them, even though they should think our conduct foolish, perverse, or wrong. Mill held that individuals were the best judges of their own interests, as they knew more about themselves than any external agent could, because they know their own interests. They will generally make wise decisions, for it is privilege and proper condition to a human being. Mill held that individuals were the best judges of their own interests, as they knew more about themselves than any other external agent could. Because they know their own interests, they will generally make wise decisions, for it is the privilege and the proper condition of a human being arrived at a maturity of his faculties to use and interpret experiences in his own way. Isaiah. Weird. Individuals are to be allowed to err, to interfere with their decision making process, even when that interference may objectively improve his or her condition, is to rob them of their autonomy. To rob them of their autonomy. Mill, for example, wrote of how, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, and that all errors which the individual is likely to commit against advice and warning are far outweighed by the evil of allowing others to constrain him to what they deem his good. For Mill, with respect to his own feelings and circumstances, the ordinary man or woman has means of knowledge immeasurably surpassing those can be possessed by anyone else. Demonstrating consequentialist reasoning, Mill described it as necessary to nurture the human faculties of perception, judgment, discriminative feeling, mental capacity, and even moral preference, and as quite the chief ingredient of individual and social progress. For Mill, autonomy relates to intellectual, dispositional, and emotional capacities, where human capacity for creativity, aesthetic and emotionally sensitive, self-control, initiative, and foresight, independence, judiciousness, and moral and religion discrimination are autonomy-derived traits that define us as humans and separate us from the other species. The positive consequences of prioritizing individual autonomy are bountiful for both the individual and their sense of self, as and society at large. Kant and Mill's aggregated arguments provide powerful testimony in favor of autonomy underpinned by human rationality. Autonomy becomes sacrosanct, elevated over Okay. Autonomy becomes sacrosanct, elevated over other goods, such as the benevolence that may prompt a paternalistic intervention or the welfare enhancing outcomes of such an intervention. Acting on behalf of another, presuming to be better able to ascertain their interests than they, is to treat that individual as merely an instrument and not a project maker in his own right. By robbing them of the good central to life's meaning that is found in autonomy. However, as subsequent philosophers have noted, both Kant and Mill provide scope for some particularized paternalistic intervention. For example, in his discussion of suicide interventions, Scholby notes that by making liberty the handmaid of rational autonomy, the Kantian opens the door to justifiable paternalism. Scholby argues Shelby argues some interferences with individual liberty can help us achieve our rationally chosen ends instead of thwarting them. Specifically, paternalism interventions can be justified on Kantian grounds if we stand a reasonable chance of preventing the agent from performing actions she chose due to distorted reasoning, and which would result in that agent's rationally chosen ends not being fully realized as they would have been had she so acted. As for Mill, while he is correctly regarded as one of the principal theorists in stressing the importance of autonomy, he expected the selling oneself into slavery as an example whereby paternalistic intervention by a third party was permissible. In his argument against conscripting oneself into servitude, Mill notes that in doing so, an individual abdicates his liberty and foregoes any future use of it beyond that single act. He therefore defeats, in his own case, the very purpose which is the justification of allowing him to dispose of himself. Mill thus carves out an exception on the basis that restrictions on an individual's autonomy in the short term are desirable if they protect or enhance their autonomy in the long term. Put differently, we may be justified in interfering with someone's autonomy to prevent them from having less autonomy in the future. These expectations notwithstanding, Kant and Mill's argument provide the strongest case against paternalism and the backdrop against which advocates of paternalism must struggle. The default assumption that guides much of the general debate around paternalism proceeds from the assumption that human beings are best capable of determining and pursuing what is in their own interest. Paternalism is seemingly placed on the defensive because it is not only questions in this core assumption, but then proceeds to trample on the autonomy that the assumption bequeaths. מילה מגעילה. This superstanding of judgment is found in pejorative definitions of paternalism as a special relation between two people, one of whom looks down on the other as incompetent to manage his affairs. Predicated on the assumption that the subject does not know that it is her interest or what is good for her. Indeed, the etymology of paternalism invokes the inescapable power dynamic of the father-son dyad that, for paternalism's critics, needlessly infantilizes and paternalized, treating them as incapable agents of their own life plan. For Cornell, the problem with paternalism is that it expresses something insulting. However, we have not yet arrived at a clear understanding of what paternalism actually is. The next section moves us further along that path. Definition and conceptual properties. Following Mill, there followed several decades of relative silence about paternalism. In ethical and political philosophy, until the concept was revived by Gerald Dworkin in a seminal essay that was the first to take paternalism seriously as a concept in its own right and provide a working definition and explication of its properties. Dworkin defines paternalism as the interference with a person's liberty of action justified by reason, referring exclusively to the welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, or values of the person being coerced. These are three criteria that constitute paternalism under Dworkin's rubric. Interference, an intervention broadly conceived in the subject's capacity to choose for themselves. Coercion, רגע שנייה, אז יש לנו interference, coercion, and benevolence. Interference, an intervention broadly conceived in the subject capacity to choose from themselves. Coercion, whereby the subject does not consent to the interference or have a say in its nature. And benevolence, whereby the interference is conducted with benevolent intent. Subsequent scholars, I want to be sharp on this. Okay, סבבה. Makes sense. Subsequent scholars in applied ethics and political philosophy have expanded upon Dworkin's work, generating a lively body of literature, but one marred by a general lack of agreement on a clear definition of what constitutes paternalism. For example, כמה הודעות.
ההורות אני רואה שהם גם שונים, אז אני מניחה שזה גם לא שלט, כאילו ניסיתי, זה לא עבד, וההורות הם ממש חלשים, יש דרך להגיע אותם, שזה אמור להיות ככה.
Okay. For example, scholars have offered an expansive view of what interference can constitute, moving beyond simply freedom of action to incorporate freedom of information. Such interference may be found in acts, omissions, diminished opportunities to choose, and substitutions of judgment. The benevolence conditions is a reminder that paternalism is inherently rational and concerns how we treat people. When we engage in paternalistic conduct, we interfere with their autonomy for benevolent reasons. Any such paternalistic actions, then, cannot be understood as the action alone, but an action motivated by a reason born of that relationship. For Grill, the normative core of paternalism is the invocation of the good of a person as a reason for interference with her. Drawing these works together, one is drawing to a definition of paternalism that addresses the manifold dimensions of paternalistic intervention and the context in which they occur. Therefore, Clerk's definition of paternalism as any action that aims to close an option that would otherwise be open in order to promote the paternalized good. Seems particularly useful to this end. Close an option that would otherwise be open in order to promote the paternalized good. So, seems particularly useful to this end, gives it broad applicability to areas such as journalism, which does not intrude directly upon liberty of action and provides the interpretive framework for decision-making, which Toll and describe as choice architecture beyond these core criteria. Scholars have, איפה הנקודה פה? Scholars have differentiated between different types of and contexts of paternalism. Some key distinctions are between paternalism as broad or narrow, hard or soft, strong or weak, negative or positive, and moral or welfare oriented. The question of broad versus narrow um, mm, אה, סבבה. The question of broad versus narrow paternalism concerned the paternalist. Narrow paternalism strictly concerns state coercion. Indeed, much of the early literature on paternalism concerned the state and the extent to which it could compel or punish conduct on paternalistic grounds. On the other hand, broad paternalism, as one might guess, concerns an array of actors and institutions beyond the state, as illustrated by the ample literature from applied ethics. Such actors may include teachers and school administrations, researchers, and healthcare professionals. Soft and hard paternalism concern the issue of agent autonomy. Hard paternalism is characterized by a concern for the safety and welfare of a person that advocates restrictions on liberty above their objections, even when the person is fully cognizant of his or her actions and their consequences. Soft paternalism, on the other hand, with protecting and is concerned with protecting and enhancing the autonomy of individuals, justifying restrictions of liberty only to ascertain whether the person is in question were indeed choosing to harm or endanger himself or herself with full volition and knowing of the facts. Put another way, soft paternalism occurs when a paternalistic suspect of when a paternalist suspects the rationality of individual is in question, or when their capacity for rational processing is compromised. In similar fashion, so like when someone is drunk, when someone is doing drugs and you don't think they're doing the right thing for themselves, then if you stop someone who wants to get behind the wheel when they're drunk, then you're doing like soft paternalism. In similar fashion, weak and strong paternalism concerns the relationship between means and end. Weak paternalism holds that it is legitimate to interfere with the means that agents choose to achieve their ends, if those means are likely to defeat those ends. While strong paternalism believes that people may have mistaken, confused, or irrational ends, and it is legitimate to interfere to prevent them from achieving those ends. Negative and positive paternalism concern the distinction between interventions to prevent harm and interventions to promote good. Legrand and New use the example of seatbelt laws as a form of negative paternalism and subsidies subsidies for leisure facilities as a form of positive paternalism. Okay. Okay. The underlying distinction here is between paternalism as non-maleficence versus paternalism as beneficence. Finally, Moral and welfare paternalism differ on the nature of good and harm yielded, whereas moral welfare is concerned with the moral well-being of the person and their character. Welfare paternalism is concerned more broadly with maximizing the opportunities to improve in an individual circumstance. Legrand and New define moral paternalism as the prevention of moral harm, which, uh, which excludes physical, psychological, and economic harm, which would be considered considered the preserve and priority of welfare paternalism. How might this pertain to journalism? Clearly, journalism can be categorized as a kind of broad paternalism, given that it involves non-state actors. My specific concern is for journalistic paternalism that is soft. In this sense, that is intervenes to provide a choice architecture to audience. Okay, my specific concern is for journalist paternalism that is soft in the sense that it intervenes to provide a choice architecture to audiences whose decision making is compromised. Weak in so much as it is that it intervenes to achieve the ends of citizen flourishing and whole persons in democracy. Positive in the sense that journalists act to promote welfare enhancing outcomes, and welfare oriented rather than moralistic, in so much that it aims to provide citizens with the tools they need to self govern. Of course, these preliminaries require further expansion. In the next section, I draw on recent work in applied ethics and political philosophy to put flesh on these proverbial bones. Applying paternalism to journalism. This section applies to the general principles outlined above This section applied the general principles outlined above to journalism, illustrating how paternalism can be a useful lens for conceiving of journalism. First, I discuss empirical research from behavioral economics that posits that we exist in a state of bounded rationality, where our capacity for rational uh, for rational thought is compromised. Calling for a journalist calling for a journalism that creates the conditions for analytic processing. Second, I discuss how the concept of nudges and choice architecture can inform our understanding of a journalistic paternalism that is non-coercive yet guides audiences towards welfare-enhancing outcomes. Third, I outline how the aspirations of paternalism are synergetic with those of virtue ethics, which has been a subject of renewed interest in media ethics scholarship recently. Drawing primarily on the work of Sigal Ben Porat, I discuss how paternalism shifts the focus away from autonomy towards the expansion of opportunity and civic quality. Accordingly, I suggest that these aspirations should constitute the part of journalism telos. יופי, נראה לי אני אפסיק כאן, כמעט חצי מאמר. ויופי. And